Hello, Nicole.
Hi, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm well. I'm very well. Very glad to have you on the podcast. The reason I wanted to interview you is because I'd seen watched a couple of interviews that you've done from years gone by about your life and what you're doing now, and the story in itself was just wild. It should be, I mean, it's in all seriousness, it should be either a mini series or a movie because it's a wild, wild story that you've come out the other end of. So before we get into it, can you just explain to people who you are, your very brief synopsis of your life, and then what you're doing now?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm not going to give you the heavily redacted version so that you can just kind of ask questions about, what parts you're interested in. I currently am the executive director of an organization called the Elizabeth Fry Society of Saskatchewan. And what we do is we're a nonprofit that supports women that are criminalized or that might be criminalized. A lot of the work that we do is around supporting women once they have involvement with the criminal justice system and, court support, bail planning, those sorts of things. But also we do a lot of support around addiction and reintegration and cultural supports as well, because where I live in Canada, I'm right smack in the middle of the country in a province called Saskatchewan. And despite the fact that we only have 9% of Indigenous population in this province, 95% of the women that are incarcerated are Indigenous. So we have a lot of cultural programming as well. How I ended up in the work that I'm currently doing is it's very personal to me. I would say it absolutely is a passion project, and I'm purpose driven. I grew up here in Saskatchewan, and I grew up quite close to a reserve, and I'm seventh generation in Canada. And my grandparents relied heavily on the Indigenous people that lived close to them when they came as settlers. And so, yes, I'm a colonizer. And I see all the really negative effects of colonialism. And so, it's really important to me that I personally am not perpetrating harm. But I grew up here and came from a family of basically functioning alcoholics. It's really common here. People drink a lot. It's not a big deal. And so one thing that I didn't learn while I was growing up was how to cope. Well, not a lot of self-awareness around what to do if you find yourself in a negative situation. And after getting 2 university degrees at the university here, I became a lawyer. And just before law school, I married somebody that I knew from high school who also had a bit of a drinking problem. And so there was a lot of partying going on. And then the abuse started. So I'm trying to be a lawyer and I'm trying to practice immigration law, interestingly. And I'm in this really terrible marriage where there is a lot of violence and substance use. And I end up ultimately, in the end, losing my career and my children and everything that I love. And at that point, I was living on the coast in Canada. And I thought, well, maybe I'll go back to Saskatchewan and be close to my family again. And I'll be able to pull my shit back together. And I come back to Saskatchewan, and instead I get heavily involved in the trafficking world. And at first, it was a lot of survival dealing because I didn't have any money and I couldn't work. I had been disbarred as a lawyer. And so I started survival dealing, and then knowing people on the coast in Vancouver, and then knowing people in the scene in Saskatoon, started bringing quantities of methamphetamine back from Vancouver to Saskatchewan, and then ended up getting linked in with organized crime, and got myself a 3.5 year prison sentence. And so, yeah, that's the redacted version.
I was going to say that's the very heavily redacted version. So,
Yeah,
going
for
to
sure.
really delve into depth. So, obviously, you talked about your family there and
Yeah.
your background. But correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you've had addiction in your family as well, but didn't you
Yeah.
have a drug, you talk about drug runs, wasn't your first drug run at 8 years old with your father?
Yeah, so I don't know, like probably you and probably a lot of the people that would be listening maybe wouldn't have a context of Canada, right? So Canada is a pretty big country. It's a little bit bigger than the US, and there is only about 31 million people in Canada, whereas in the States, there's like 331. So there's not a huge population. And even the cities, that like I grew up in a town of 500. And like I said, seventh generation in Canada, lots of ranching in my family, you know, conservatism, very conservative family. But drinking is really common. It's just something that people do here, like every day. And so my mom's family, despite the fact that they, you know, were functioning alcoholics, they all drove like, you know, $100,000 trucks, and they all had their own businesses. And there was no divorcing in my family. Like my great grandparents, ultimately is who I grew up with, because my mom was the only person that ever got a divorce in that family. And I grew up with my great grandparents, and they were married for 76 years. My grandparents were married for 60 years, and that's just what you did. You owned your house, you owned your vehicle, you had a business, and on the outside, it really looked like you had it together. You know, my mom married my dad, who came from an immigrant family, and that was a little bit different. And there was 11 of those kids, and they all had both alcohol and drug problems. So my dad, you know, he was a little bit wilder than my mom, and he would do all sorts of crazy things. And when I was 8 years old, he decided that he was going to take us down to Disneyland, and it turned out that it actually was a drug run. I didn't know that until I was much older. I was in my early 20s when I found that out. And it tracked because my dad was the one who introduced me to hash and marijuana when I was like 15 years old. He told me how to basically hustle dope on the weekends so that I could make enough money just to have money for drugs and booze on the weekend. And this was not something that my mom's family knew anything about. And so yeah, my dad, totally different thing. And he's also the one who introduced me to cocaine when I was 19 as well.
That's just wild. I mean, I just can't imagine that happening. Did you get any sense that there was any danger when that happened? I know you're a young kid, so your perception is
Yeah.
different as an adult, but did you think, oh, this doesn't seem like Disneyland? Like, what's that person doing there with a father and whatnot?
Well, we did cross into Tijuana. And so we went to, and my mom was clued out. Like she had no clue at all. And they were actually divorced at the time. So I feel like he was using us as a beard. We went down there for 2 days to Disneyland. We went to like Knott's Berry Farm and Universal Studios and all that. And then he's like, I want to go down to Mexico. So we go down to Mexico, and we're in Tijuana, and we were in like the rough part of Tijuana. And I can remember him and my mom arguing. Like I was only 8, right? And then when we came back into Canada, we were at a hotel in a city, a bigger city, a province over. And my dad left us in the hotel and was out partying for the night, but it was probably because he was meeting his connect, right? And these are things that you know, I remember little pieces of. So then when it came back up when I was older, you know, I was like, yeah, that tracks. And I brought it up to my mom, and I was like, you know what he was doing, right? And she was like, well, you know, in the end, I thought that was something maybe he was doing, but I wasn't sure, because she was really naive about things like that. She had me when she was 18. It was like a month after her 18th birthday. And that's how I ended up with my grandparents, right? My dad was a bit older, and yeah, a bit wilder for sure. He died in active addiction. So his whole life was like that. Yeah.
Was that the first time he'd take you out on something like that, or use you as a cover for a drug run, or did it?
You know, like I said, as far as I know, I think that was the only thing that ever happened like that. But there was it for him. I don't think it was ever about making large amounts of money. I think it was just to keep the party going.
Mhm.
He always seemed to, no emotional awareness at all. And he always seemed to be struggling. And like I said, he died in active addiction. And when he died, he at the time was living in like a super rundown hotel in a one room sort of situation with bed bugs, eating at the Mission, and all those really horrible things that happen when you live a life of addiction. Like, he was 69 years old, and I was actually just coming off parole when he got sick, and because I was on parole, I had an area restriction, and I couldn't go to Vancouver to see him without my PO giving me permission. And it took a couple days for that to happen. And by the time I got to the hospice, like, he was pretty much gone. Like, I think the first day he knew that I was there, but the second and third day, I'm pretty sure he didn't. And it was just really, really sad because, I hadn't seen him for like 7 years because I was back in Saskatchewan, and then I was in prison, and he was doing his thing there, and I was, running the streets here. And when I saw him, it was just so sad because he just looked so frail. And my dad was always this really big guy, big, loud guy. And he looked so frail, and he had the death rattle, and he had bank statements in the table beside his bed. And I pulled them out, and I took a look at them, and thinking that he would have no money, because he didn't. But you could tell that the night before he went into hospice that he was on a run. So midnight, $100, 1 o'clock, $200, 3 o'clock in the morning, $200. And I'm like, he was on a run the night before he went into hospice, and he had like $40 left in his bank account.
That, that's crazy. It just seemed somewhat, yeah. I just think at
Yeah.
that age, surely there must be a point where you think, okay, this has happened to me. This is a danger that's
Yeah.
come as a result of that, and
Yeah.
you're doing it. I know addiction's a hard thing obviously to give up, but I was just wondering, to me, that just the whole, not just getting the drugs, but just the running thing, like, for surely you must slow down by now.
Yeah. Well, I think, there's this saying, when you're in chaotic drug use and you come into like a program like Narcotics Anonymous, it's like ways and means to get drugs. And so, like, that's slowly what happened to me with my life. Like, I was somebody that always drank. I drank through law school, when I was a practicing lawyer, and I practiced for a little over 5 years, and I was a prosecutor for a bit as well. And like, during that whole period of time, I would drink like pretty much every day a bottle of wine or whatever. But then, right, I think it was like the first year after law school, when I moved out to the coast, and my marriage sort of started falling apart a little bit, and he started being more and more emotionally and physically abusive. I started drinking, like, every day. But then also I started using cocaine as well. And I think that since, I spent my life watching my parents normalize coping with negative emotions with substances, whether it was booze for my mom or it was booze and drugs for my dad, that was super normalized, right? So it didn't seem like it was so bad when I was doing it. And then, it slowly just consumes every aspect of your life. And it just takes over, right? And I don't think that you necessarily intend for it to get like that, but it absolutely does. And so, going from, maybe drinking half a bottle of wine Monday to Friday, and then only partying on the weekends with drugs, and then all of a sudden, it's every day. It's Thursday and Monday, or it's like, every day of the week. I would go to court, like, and get high before I went in, because I would be tired from partying for 2 days, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, it kind of just consumes you. And yeah, it's absolutely what happened with me.
So after that run and after that happened, you obviously grew up, getting a teenager, and then you started going to law school. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I kind of I was a bit of a wild kid. I dropped out of high school in like grade 10, and living in Saskatchewan at the time, and my dad was on the coast in Vancouver. And I would hitchhike back and forth all the time. And it's about 2,000 kilometers, so it's a bit of a trek. But I would hitchhike back and forth from Vancouver all the time. And So I you know, lots of partying during that period of time. And like I said, my dad introduced me to hard drugs. And every once in a while, though, I would want to come back to Saskatchewan and kind of like rest and kind of pull my crap back together, because I wasn't like, I'd have jobs, like pissy jobs or whatever. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, when I was 21 and I'd been working in a bar for a couple years, I was like, you know what, I think I want a kid now. And like, I wasn't in a relationship or anything like that. I just decided I wanted to have a kid. Like I said, I was a wild kid. And so I ended up having my first child when I was 22 years old. And as a result of that, I pulled it together and I was like, okay, I'm going to go to university now. So I wrote my equivalency exam and I did really well on it. And so I was able to apply to university as a mature student. And I started university and I did a sociology degree, and I had already been working in outreach. So, you know, helping people in community with different services, mostly youth. And then I had always kind of wanted to be a lawyer. So I wrote the LSAT and ended up with a really good mark and got into law school.
And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you meet a biker gang? Is that how you and your husband first met?
No, that came later. Like, went to law school, and I married him right before law school, and we had our first child together when I was in second year law school. And basically, when I graduated from law school, I ended up going to the coast, to Vancouver, to practice law. And so for about 5 years, when I was practicing, nothing was really going on in respect to too much crime. He was a drug dealer. Before I married him, I knew he was a drug dealer. He had basically promised me that he wouldn't deal drugs anymore since I was trying to be a lawyer. And that was kind of the agreement. But it became clear really quickly in our marriage that he wasn't really interested in working a straight job. And you know, he wasn't really interested in living the kind of life that, you know, I had wanted for myself at that point. And so when we moved out to Vancouver, he had been back and forth from Vancouver also, and that's where he was dealing like large amounts of drugs, but not hard drugs. He was dealing marijuana. And so when we moved out to the coast, he then, you know, was around a bunch of his friends that were dealers. He was not involved in any real organized crime or anything like that. It was basically just a bunch of upper middle class white guys that thought they were cool because they sold marijuana. That's what he was about. You know, his family had money, and everyone he hung out with, their families had money, and it was basically a way for them to not have to have real jobs. And so that's just what he did. And he was terrible. He was a terrible drug dealer.
Mhm.
So, you know, everything that I learned about dealing drugs was by watching him going, oh, you don't do it that way.
Terrible in what sense?
He would like front people, like he would cuff people all the time. And then when they owed him money, he wouldn't do anything about it. And his profit, he would party all his profit away all the time. Like he would buy things that he you know, shouldn't be buying, or he would let people bring him like goods instead of cash. So you can't reload with goods, not cash. Like he just was not good at it. And it got way worse when he started using hard drugs, because he just was really mostly interested in getting loaded. That was what it was about. Yeah.
That's
So
mad.
yeah.
That's mad.
It's
So,
terrible.
yeah, I think we're about a third of the way through the interview, and already my jaw's just dropping on the floor because I can't think it's going to get any worse, but it does.
It does.
Yeah,
It
it
gets
does
much
very
worse,
much
yeah.
so. Um, so when did the abuse start in that relationship?
So I think like before we moved to BC, like when I was in law school, none of that was really happening, like the physical part. You know, emotionally and mental abuse was definitely there from the beginning. And again, you know, I think that he was a lot like my dad in a lot of ways. And so again, I normalized some of those behaviors. Like he absolutely had a very serious drinking problem because he would black out all the time and he wouldn't remember. And I always remembered. And so when we moved to Vancouver and I was away from my family and he started using harder drugs is when the physical abuse started. So we moved out there, and I think it was probably only a couple months after we got out there, he ended up in a car accident and he screwed up his back. And this was sort of at the beginning of the whole OxyContin thing.
Okay.
And his doctor was giving him 1680s every like 2 weeks. So he was getting huge amounts of OxyContin. And so at first he was just trading them for cocaine, and then he was selling them, and he had an opiate addiction. I had a cocaine addiction, and then I also got an opiate addiction. And I think that physical abuse just sort of follows those sorts of situations, you know? And so when we were in BC is when it started, and it carried through until the end when I left. So
How long did it go on for? How many years were you with him before you decided enough is enough, I need to go?
So it was really interesting how I ended up leaving, because when we were in BC, like I said, I ended up getting disbarred. I was working for a firm where I had a fee splitting agreement. So I was responsible for bringing my own clients into the firm, and we split the money 50-50. And the first year that I worked for them, I billed 120,000 as a junior. And then the next year, I think I built up to like 160, and then it started going down because I was too busy getting high and drunk. So I practiced for like 5 years, and that was going on in the background, and I ended up getting disbarred as a result of taking cash under the table from some clients. And you have to put it through your trust account, and that's not what I was doing, because you have to wait for that money, and when you're in active addiction you need that money now. And so after I got disbarred, my children were taken away from me because I basically tried to commit suicide at that point. I was really, at the time, I didn't think that I cared that I was going to get disbarred, but when it actually happened, it was pretty devastating to me. And things got really bad in BC in respect to some really low bottom drug addict behaviors. My kids were gone, and so it really didn't matter what happened at that point. And so he and I started doing things like, Home Depot scams, stealing from different stores, all those sorts of things, and hanging out with people that were just like, basically doing whatever they could to get drugs. And so at that point it just occurred to me, like, I don't want to live like this. And with the addiction, I just was so absolutely miserable. And I did try to commit suicide at that one point, and that's all I kind of thought about. Like I had a death wish, like I wanted to die. And at the same time, though, I also didn't want to be living like that. And so we came back to Saskatchewan. I was going to come back with or without him. And he ended up coming with me. And for the first year that we were here, we were dealing out of the house together. And then we got evicted. And I ended up taking that as an opportunity to leave.
Okay. Just yeah, again, just a shock when I say that. When you left, how did he take it?
He did not take it well. He basically stalked me for the next year and a half. I would like, and I was homeless. Like I had nowhere to live a lot of the time when I first left him. And like I said, I was basically survival dealing, because when I was with him, I didn't have to deal the drugs. Like I would go with him on drug runs to go get dope. I would go with him to do things, but I wasn't really dealing with anybody, right? I just was there because that's how I got my drugs. So when we finally did split up, I was homeless for a little bit. And then I started dealing a little bit more quantity and that sort of thing, not so much for survival. And then I had something kind of terrible happen to me. Someone tried to murder me. They kicked my door in at the hotel that I was staying in and hit me over the head with a golf club. I don't know how many times, but I ended up in the hospital with 33 staples in my head. And I was there for almost 6 weeks. And when I got released from the hospital, I was still homeless. And so that's sort of when I started stepping up my game. And that's also when he started getting crazier, because when I was in the hospital, I'd have security have him escorted out. But then when I was like out of the hospital, he was able to just basically stalk me. And he would break into my apartment and cut up all my clothes. He would break into my apartment and beat me up. Like, he was tricky too. Like, people would be at my place and he'd knock on the door and then like hide. And when someone opened the door, he'd like push his way in. And this went on for, I don't know how long, probably about a year or something like that, until I finally got a boyfriend. And, I didn't really need a boyfriend. I didn't really want a boyfriend, but that was the only way that he was leaving me alone.
How long ago did this happen? How many years are we talking? What year about?
The year that I got my head beaten in with the golf club was 2012.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
reasons. The reason I
Yeah.
asked that is because of the stalking. Because I don't know what the stalking laws are like in Canada. What could
Yeah.
you I know you had issues with drugs and whatnot, but could you have gone to the police? Could you have, or did you? And if so, what did they say? What could you have done something different to stop the stalking or go to authorities?
You know, the thing about the stigma of people that are in active addiction, the police, they don't want to help you, right? So when we were still living together before we got evicted, the police would get called to our house all the time because we had somebody that lived in the basement of the house we were living in. And like, they would show up at at least 4 or 5 times. That happened. And one time, they showed up, and the cop just, basically, like, she was like, why aren't you leaving? And I said, I'm trying to leave. I don't have the resources to leave. And they never would charge him. And in Canada, they're supposed to charge no matter what. And they wouldn't charge him. And one time he had thrown all my stuff out onto the street, and the cop showed up, and I had choke marks and I had a black eye. And the cop, he's like, I said, can you just watch him so I can go in the house and get a suitcase so that I can pick my stuff up? And I came back out with the suitcase, and I said to the cop, I said, aren't you obligated to charge him? Because I know this. And he said, you're lucky I let you get a suitcase, sweetheart. That's what he said. So, this was an ongoing sort of situations. The cops knew who we were, or the cops knew who we were. And like, I didn't feel like it was even safe to go and make a complaint about the things that, were happening then. Because even when I got my head bashed in, they weren't really supportive around that either. I had one police officer at one point phone my phone, and he was like, I heard that they're still trying to kill you. I said, well, that's great. Why are you phoning me to tell me that? Shouldn't you be doing something about that? So, yeah.
Yeah, well, not, I mean, what he did to you was horrendous, but outside of that, with the drugs a lot on top of that, I just don't understand what, especially if it's law as well,
Yeah.
why they
Yeah.
did nothing. Did anything happen? I imagine the answer is going to be no to these, but I'll ask anyway. Did anything happen to those police officers later down the line?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about the police officers. It's really weird because in my job now, I'm very involved with the government, like the Ministry of Corrections, the Ministry of Justice. That's where we get a lot of our funding. And I'm at the police station quite a bit. And I even had a kind of a laugh about 6 months ago. I was there for a meeting, and one of the officers was like, did you guys want a tour? I said, that's okay, I've had one. Because I've been in the cells there. But I also kind of feel like there's been sort of a shift in attitudes in like, I mean, there's still a lot of stigma around addiction, but at that point, I think that that's when it was really on the rise in Saskatchewan, and people didn't really understand a lot about it. So there was absolutely more stigma attached to it than I think that there is now, because now people understand that you need supports and help and treatment and all those sorts of things. And that wasn't as common then. You just basically were considered a criminal. And, there wasn't a lot of basically linking between survival-based crimes or how addiction affects people to engage in those sorts of behaviors, right? And I think that there's been a bit of shift around that for sure. I haven't run into any of those police officers, and to be honest, I don't know if I would have recognized them anyways,
Mm.
because at that point I was using methamphetamine. So it was, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, crazy. Because even you said the whole abuse took place in 2012, so obviously it's happened a little bit later. It seems
yeah.
at that stage Canada was a bit far behind from the rest of the Western world in terms of how it dealt with it, which surprised me when you told me that, because I would have thought it'd be the opposite, in fact.
It always does seem like we're, I think, a little bit behind it, and not so much in Vancouver, because BC, that's a different situation. And I think Ontario, also a different situation. Bigger communities, more access to ports, that sort of thing. Like Vancouver, like when I was dealing with organized crime in Saskatoon, that's where they were getting all of their drugs. It was from Vancouver, right? Because the ports there are basically controlled by organized crime, so it's easy to bring in the materials that they need to cook drugs or whatever. Because that's also when fentanyl kind of started, was in like 2012 here. That's OxyContin, they changed the formula,
Hmm.
and that's when they started pressing pills for OxyContin or for fentanyl, and that's when that sort of started around then too. Yeah,
So after all that's happened, and by the way, I forgot to mention before getting to my next point, you talk about this biker gang, like you got engaged,
yeah.
and wasn't it?
I'm not naming names because I could get myself in trouble with that.
No, no, no,
So
don't name names,
yeah,
don't name
yeah,
names, but
yeah.
the biker gang, what gang you got involved with, and then there's something that happened one day where the police were watching you and you ended up being arrested and charged and whatnot. Do you want to just go into that story as well?
Yeah, and I can actually talk about this because it was all over the news. So after the incident with me almost getting my or almost dying, basically I met some people that were able to supply like large amounts of drugs, and it was because I was moving quite a bit at that point, and so I met somebody, and he happened to be heading up a gang called the Fallen Saints. And basically, he would provide me with large amounts of drugs, and I would sell them, and then I would go pick up. And it wasn't that I was hanging out with them or anything like that. It was just that's who I got drugs from, right? And I'd been dealing for him for probably, I don't know, 6 to 8 months, and like every day going into the clubhouse and picking up, and then going out and doing my thing, and then coming back. And I started noticing, I think it was probably almost a month before I finally did end up getting busted, that I was being followed. And since I was using, not really sure if you're paranoid, not really sure if you're being followed. And even if you are being followed, it doesn't matter anyways, because what else are you going to do? So I was living in a trap house, and it's funny because I was participating in a study on trap houses yesterday, and we were kind of talking about where I was living when this happened. And I was living in this place, and I was coming out of the back, and like 4 cop cars surrounded me, and I was actually on the way out to go and reload. So I had a bunch of cash on me, and I had like, I think it was only somewhere between a quarter pound and a half pound of meth, because I was just about to get rid of that and go get more. And it was in a dope hider in my purse, and I got arrested for a breach on something that I thought wasn't even a thing anymore, because I had been in and out of the women's provincial correctional a few times for other things. And so yeah, they got me on it. They said that I had breached my conditions. So took me down to the police station, and I was in the room and waiting for them, and I could hear all of a sudden all these cops cheering. So they clearly figured out how to open my dope hider. And then they pulled me out of the room, and they were like, "Do you want to tell us where you got all this meth from?" And I was like, no, I don't really want to tell you where I got all this meth from. So at that point, because I didn't really have a criminal record, like it was very minimal, and they let me out on bail. And I just continued doing what I was doing. I continued to sell drugs. I had a curfew, so I had to be a little bit careful about it. But I I was out, I don't know how long, I don't know, probably about 4 months only. And they did a condition check on me, and I wasn't supposed to have any cell phones, and I had 13 of them. So I got rearrested. And because I sold cell phones too, whatever. So I got rearrested, and this was like right at the end of December. And the day after I got arrested, the cops went around and arrested 13 or 14 bikers and fallen saints. And I was shitting myself, because I'm the only person that is not in the gang. I'm the only person that is not, involved in that way. I'm a woman, and everybody in jail are looking at me sideways because they think I snitched, right?
Oh,
They think I snitched. So lucky for me, the next day, the newspaper comes out, and the guy that I was linked with, that was the head, like he was the VP, he was the one that actually was the snitch. They worked for a different club, a different organization that we won't definitely talk about. And he had his clubhouse, cameras, audio, everything. And the cops had been watching him for 4 months. And they tried to get him on a murder conspiracy beef. And they basically said, if you snitch, we won't try you for this. And so that's what happened. And yeah, I was shitting bricks for like a day and a half, because I was sure that everybody thought that it was me that was the snitch, but it wasn't. So yeah,
and was it 3 years you were in prison for in the end for that?
I got 3.5 years, but I only ended up serving 10 months, and I served 21 months in community on parole.
So what was the 10 months you were actually inside? What was that
Yeah.
like?
So, I love to tell people I've been to prison, but I actually like wasn't really in prison, because I was in the women's correctional, which is rough. The women's correctional is super rough. It's provincial, and it's hard time. And I was in like semi-secure because I was considered to be gang affiliated. And there's a lot of violence, and it's not a great place to be. But that's a provincial institution, right? And so since I got a federal sentence, I thought that I was going to be transferred to the women's federal penitentiary, which is a province over in Edmonton. It's Edmonton Max. And the morning that they were transferring me out, because I just pled out, I was like, you know what, I could try to fight this, but they've got video footage of me and all sorts of like pictures of me all over town selling drugs. I'm just going to plead out, get this over, and start my life over. And I thought I was going to Edmonton Max. And the morning that they were transferring me, I was shackled up and everything. And they told me that I was going to the Women's Healing Lodge. And what that is, it's literally what it sounds like. It's a healing lodge in the middle of nowhere on a reserve, where the focus is basically healing trauma and getting reconnected to the land and culture. And yeah, so I didn't end up having to go to real prison, which was great. So
Healing Lodge sounds like jacuzzis and yoga and meditation. That's what it sounds. That doesn't sound like hard time. That sounds like something where you think, actually, if this is what I get for doing what I did, maybe it's worth it because you'd have to pay hundreds if you had to do this on a membership. That's what it sounds like to me.
it's not quite like that. It's funny because when I would disappear for a couple of days when I was going into the correctional on and off, so I used to tell people would be like, "Where have you been?" I'm like, "The spa," but it wasn't the spa. Like correctional was not fun. Like I got in fights in there. Like it was not good. Lots of shitty shit happening in there. But the Healing Lodge, it was built for Indigenous women, right, to reconnect them to their culture. And I'm non-Indigenous, but I am from Saskatchewan, and they do try to pen place you closest to your home. And I was just basically lucky that they had spots. And it's not a jacuzzi or anything like that, but they do have a lot of programming that they don't have in the Max. Like, for example, there's no fences. It's just literally in the middle of nowhere. You can't run away because it's like tree, moose, tree, cougar. Like you can't run away. You're like in the middle of nowhere. You would not get anywhere, and it's on a reserve. So if you leave the grounds, people on the reserve are calling and they're like, "Hey, one of your people one of your people's trying to run away." They do have horses. They did have horses, and you worked every day, and you cooked your own food, and yeah. So I used it as an opportunity to heal and recover for sure.
Was there times, and I'm kind of half jokingly saying this, where you riding a horse or using a spa and you're thinking, I wonder what those bastards who did what to me. I wonder what they're doing. I hope they're rotting in jail and stuff like this while you're in a spa just chilling.
It wasn't a spa.
Yeah, I know. I'm half joking.
I am not that kind of person. I don't carry hate in my heart. I really don't. Even the people that bashed my head in with a golf club, I forgave them. And one actually ended up committing suicide over that. He called me a couple days before he did, and he was like, "I just need you to know that I'm really sorry." And I had already forgiven him at that point. I said, "It was business. You didn't know me. Someone paid you, and you were in active addiction. And now, you are paying in a different way," because he was tormented, right? And I think that if he did that to me, he probably did stuff like that to other people as well. And he had done federal time. And, hurt people, right? And despite the fact that my husband, so much negativity came out of that relationship, and negative effects for my children and myself and my family and his family as well. And he's still in active addiction, and I've ran into him a couple times in Saskatoon, and he's a creature. Like, I don't, you can barely recognize him. He ended up contracting HIV, and he's got AIDS, and he's still in active use, and he has been since 2010. And so you can only imagine. I don't know how he's still alive, to be honest, but like, he is my kid's dad, and even though he did really horrible things to me, I don't hate him. I feel like he is living in misery. And anyone that I knew in that lifestyle that I might have had beef with, or that did not great things to me, because as a woman, that was not an easy lifestyle. And as a woman that was by herself quite a bit, it absolutely wasn't an easy lifestyle. Like, I was sexually assaulted several times. I got violently robbed several times. I was very vulnerable in that situation. And but that at the time was the lifestyle that I was involved in, and it's part of the contract, right? And I just am trying to live my life in a way that I'll be there for other people that want to get out, that I can actually be a example of what can happen. Like, I'm coming from a place of privilege, right? I'm a white lady, a middle class white lady that ended up in a really shitty situation with the addiction and those pieces. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, I have 2 university degrees and I'm fairly articulate, and I'm lucky for me, I'm still semi-intelligent. But where it does translate is I can understand what that's like to be stuck in that situation, or I can understand what it's like to be criminalized and have that stigma and be carrying that guilt and the shame. And I can translate what that's like for people and get into rooms with people that can affect policy and give money to make changes in community that will actually support transition and transformation for people. And so the jobs that I'm doing right now, I think is really important to me because I think it's a form of living amends to the community that I caused so much havoc in. And so I really feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, despite the fact I said I would never live in Saskatchewan again. Here I am. But I think I'm here for a reason, for sure.
So you have your prison sentence that ends, and then again you still, because to me, from what I've heard from other addicts, wherever it may be, addiction seems to be a still ongoing battle. Like you just almost fighting it every day. But
Yeah.
was the point where after prison, did you think? Where did you go after that to beat your addiction? Was it meetings? Was it counseling? Like, what was it that finally thought, no, I've got to stop this?
Yeah, so when I first got released, I got released in BC because my kids were with my ex-in-laws in Vernon and I wanted to be close to them. I wasn't trying to get them back or anything like that because, they were in a situation that they were stable and they were supported and happy and all of those things. So I just wanted to be close to them so I could rebuild that relationship. And I got released to a community where there was some pretty good recovery happening, and I got myself a sponsor, and I started going to Narcotics Anonymous, and like yeah, there's the first couple of years I wasn't really sure what that was going to look like because despite the fact that I have university degrees, how do I tell people that I've been to prison and find a job? Like what does that even look like? I can't be a lawyer again, I'm disbarred. And so the first couple of years were a bit of a struggle for me because I was trying to just figure out who I was and whether I could be transparent. And at first I basically chose to lie. Like I got a job and lied about where that big gap in my resume was coming from. And unfortunately, that ultimately led me to relapsing. I had 33 months clean and I went back out for 6 months. And when I relapsed, I was like, that was in 2018. When I relapsed, I was so miserable. And I had that 33 months of clean time to sort of reflect on. And I used that as sort of the foundation to come back. And I was like, I don't want to use and I don't want to get high anymore. And I don't want that life for myself anymore. But I also can't be hiding in plain sight. So that's when I was like, you know what? I'm going to tell everybody who will listen to me that I'm in recovery, that I ended up in prison, that I got disbarred, that I lost my kids. I'll tell everybody that will listen to me. And I feel like my lived experience and my education will be valued somewhere. And I'm going to use that to make changes in community. So I for a while worked for Elizabeth Fry Society in Kamloops, where I was living, and ended up working there for like 4 years, and was really transparent and started public speaking and doing different things around that. I spoke at the university, to the law school. I spoke at a judges conference, a provincial judges conference in front of 140 judges. I don't recommend that to anybody. That was very nerve-wracking. But a really good friend of mine that also had done federal time for trafficking that I met in prison got a hold of me, and she was like, Elizabeth Fry in Saskatchewan needs an executive director. And I said, I'm not coming back there. I don't want to live there again. And I ended up coming back. So I have been clean now almost 6.5 years. But it is an everyday thing. And I think that for me, like I have an Instagram page that's all about recovery, and I have a sponsor, and I haven't really been going to meetings here because it's sort of weird here. But I still do different things to support my recovery. And I think that my job is absolutely one of those things.
You kind of mentioned it in your last answer there, but the public speaking, obviously,
Yeah.
I do it so often now, and you've done quite a few of these podcast interviews, so used to. But what was it like when you first had to get up on stage and speak about your story, especially in the town where you grew up?
Yeah. So I've only done a bit of public speaking in town here. I've done, yeah, no, I guess I have done a little bit, yeah. You know what? People really, it's always really well received because people want to hear those stories, right? And I think that they appreciate the transparency and my ability to be vulnerable about it. And you know, I always get a little bit nervous at the very beginning. I last spring I spoke in front of the Canadian Bar Association, in front of a bunch of judges and lawyers, and it depends who I'm speaking to. I'm speaking next week too, and it depends who I'm speaking to, but you know, it's coming from the heart because these are things that I went through, and I think that they should be used in a way that give people hope that they can change, or you know, that they can find those supports, or if they're on the other end of it, so that they can understand what you know, people go through and how they end up where they end up, because a lot of people just, you know, they judge, right? And it honestly, it could happen to anybody. And so I think that that's what I would like people to understand.
Mm. In the years that all these things has happened to you, and obviously being involved in the legal side as well, how do you think Canada has dealt with um, addiction and people with addicts who commit crime over the years? Is it something that the law has changed on it, or is it stuck in its ways in many regards? Like, how do you think the country deals with it as a whole?
So I think, you know, British Columbia and Saskatchewan are two different places, for example. When I was in BC, the provincial government there has been building, you know, supportive and transitional housing hand over fist to start supporting what's going on around homelessness and addiction and that sort of thing. And you know, building housing that has built-in supports like nurses and overdose prevention and harm reduction and all those pieces that you need, and individualized like case plans, so that people do have their best chance. And you know that there's always going to be people that use substances, and there's going to be people that don't want to quit, and that's fine. That doesn't mean that they don't deserve their basic needs met, right? So BC as a province, they've been approaching things completely different in that there are all of those supports in place, and they continue to build more and develop more programming. Well, when I worked somewhere like that in BC as well, but when I came back to Saskatchewan, I was quite shocked to see what was going on here, because there's a serious homelessness issue in the city that I'm living in right now. Like the population is only about 270,000, and we have like you know, 1,500 homeless people in the last point in time count, but it gets minus 30 here, you know, and that's the difference, because British Columbia on the coast in Vancouver, it might get to -2, you know, Kamloops, it might get to -15, but they've got housing, they've got shelters, they've got places for people to go. Here we don't. They're, you know, shelters are always sort of like a last minute consideration in October when it starts getting cold. It's like everybody's like, oh yeah, we should probably get a shelter going. There isn't enough housing stock for people, so you know, lots of gaps in services and not enough treatment beds, absolutely not enough treatment beds, detox beds. And so I mean, that's a lot of the work that we do as an organization, just trying to link people with treatment and housing. And it's really frustrating because there's not enough stock. there's not enough places for people to go. And so Saskatchewan also is a very conservative government. And, they're still sort of, they don't believe in safe injection sites. They won't fund safe injection sites. They don't really believe in harm reduction, in respect to handing out like clean needles or pipes or any of that kind of stuff. They'll fund outpatient programs because they basically assign worth. So if you're somebody that's stably housed, of course you can access an outpatient program. Whereas if you're homeless, you can't go to an outpatient program. You don't even have your basic needs met. So yeah, we're 20 years behind in Saskatchewan, absolutely.
Maybe you know this story. I know remnants of this story, I'm going to say, but wasn't there a case, was it 70s or 80s, that there was, I can't remember his name, but there was a homeless man who he lived in he was on the streets in Vancouver, and he saw a lot of his friends die from addiction. So he managed to lobby some people and get some people together to kind of change the rules in Vancouver. I can't remember his name, but I remember reading about him. And that managed to have like safe injection sites and in Vancouver and whatnot. Is that still the case in Vancouver that those sites exist?
Yes. Yeah. There's Vancouver's got tons of safe injection sites, but like I said, the provincial government is also building supportive or transitional housing where people who are continuing to use drugs can live. And so there's like literal overdose prevention on site. Like I worked at a building where like if you were going to use and you knew what people were using. So if you're on your opiates and you inject, you just come to the worker and you get a kit, and then I say, do you want me to check on you in 5 minutes? Because if you did overdose, like then you can administer naloxone. Now, we had a situation in Saskatoon, for example. We do have one place that does safe injection sites, and they had to reduce their hours, and people have overdosed outside of the building because they don't have it 24 hours, right? Yeah. But the attitude's bad. So,
What reasons do like politicians give for not producing that in the area you're in? Is it an sort of scum of the earth? Or what is it? What do they say?
Oh, they think it's enabling people, right? It's enabling them to use drugs. Just like a spoon enables someone to be obese, like it doesn't enable, it makes no sense. But I think it's the conservative mentality, right?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
bizarre. What
We
would you
still have a lot
like
of
to?
racism.
Well, yeah, indeed. You say
Yeah.
racism. Wasn't that stat before? You said there's a high percentage of Indigenous people that are addicts in where you are. Was it 95?
Yeah.
Did you say?
Yeah, well, no, I don't know what the stats are for people that are in active addiction, but for women that are in the provincial institution, 95% of the women in the provincial institution are Indigenous. Yeah.
And what factors? Why are the reasons for that? What factors?
Colonialism.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much you know about Canada, but like basically like with colonialism, they did these really great things where they put people on reserves, and then they took their kids away from them and put them in something called residential schools where the church ran them and sexually and physically abused them. And in many cases, children died in these schools. And so when they left the school, whether it be by graduation or whatever, they didn't know how to parent, and they had all this trauma from the sexual and physical abuse. And so they go back to their communities, and it just basically perpetuates with, alcoholism and all those sorts of things. And so, yeah, it's colonialism. Yeah.
That sounds a little bit of those similarities. Are like what happened in Ireland with the priest and whatnot, and there seems to be similarities there, and like the abuse, like at the hands of that. But obviously, there's different factors in Canada. That's
Yeah.
crazy. Yeah, real mad.
Yeah.
Real mad.
It's not great.
No, indeed. So what? I mean, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and obviously, in many respects, you've just skimmed the surface because your story is so deep, and obviously the work you're doing now is great. Um, what's the future for you now? Just continuing where you're working. Where do you want to take your story? Because to me, something which, yes, okay, it's really bad what happened, but you can hear it inspire people. I.e., you came out of a situation and look at you now. So what do you want
Yeah.
to?
So, I signed a 5-year contract last year. So I've got 3 years and 10 months left on my contract. But when I first came back, to take this job, the organization was a little bit smaller at the time, and we didn't have any housing. And so in the last 2 years, I have almost quadrupled our budget. We had 6 or 7 staff. We now have 20 staff. We now have housing. We've got 5 sober living beds. Oh, and I opened another office in a different city. So we've got 5 sober living beds in that city. And then in this city, we just purchased a duplex with 10 beds that were partnered with addictions programs in both cities. And I just got another huge grant to do another 10 beds. And so we're going to be getting an apartment building as well. And I've got some other stuff going on right now that I don't necessarily want to jinx myself, but I'm looking at potentially having some family housing as well.
Oh, good. That's good. Very
Yeah,
good. If people
lots
want to
going
find
on.
out about your work and the work that your organisation does, where can I go?
We do have a website. It's the Elizabeth Fry Society of Saskatchewan. And on the website, it talks about colonialism and why things are kind of the way they are in the province that I live in. And I think that it's interesting for people. There are actually like 22 Elizabeth Frys across Canada. But we all do a little bit different things. And the one in that I head up, it's been around since 1981 and always focusing on women that are involved in the justice system. So,
Unbelievable.
yeah.
Just quickly before we go, obviously called Elizabeth Fry. Obviously, it's named after someone. I take it as someone who not only set it up, but who went through like what she went through.
No, she was a Quaker from the UK.
Oh gosh, okay.
In like 1880 something, and she used to go into the prisons to help support moms and kids. So yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
gosh, yeah, that is a bit of a blast from the past.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
gosh, yeah,
Also colonial though, so it's kind of
yeah,
like
indeed, indeed. Yeah,
anyways.
yeah. Anyway, I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so
Thank you,
much
Chris.
for coming on to
Yeah.
the 86 project. I'll leave those websites, what you said of Elizabeth Fry's Society, in the
It's
description.
elizabethfrysask.org is our website. Yeah.
I'll leave that in the description of this video below. All right,
Okay.
Nicole,
Thanks,
an
Chris.
absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on
Yeah,
to the
same.
podcast.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.